Hello everyone, I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. We're starting a minute or so late because it's the first of the month, and at noon, the City of Jackson tests the emergency alert siren right across the street. We didn't want to compete with that. Welcome to this week's streaming-only History is Lunch program. We're working safely with our skeleton crew from our home in the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium here in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. We'll stay in the vein of Mississippi authors next week when Casey Mosley will present Eudore Welty's Sense of Home. Please join us for that streaming program. Today, though, we are delighted to welcome Phillip Gordon to discuss his new University Press of Mississippi book, Gay Faulkner, Uncovering a Homosexual Presence in Yoknapatawpha and Beyond. Phillip Gordon is Associate Professor of English and Gay Studies Coordinator at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville, where he became the first faculty member to receive the P.B. Poorman Award for outstanding contributions to the UW system on behalf of LGBTQ+ communities. Gordon was born in Memphis, Tennessee, and grew up just north of Faulkner's fictional Yoknapatawpha County. Here's Pip Gordon.
I believe I'm on. Good. Thank you so much today for having me here. In this enormous crowd. Hello, everyone back home. I'm very pleased to be here today in particular. This event was originally scheduled for a couple months ago in March, and I was writing a talk, trying to figure out how to get started into it, planning a trip down to Mississippi, and then the pandemic occurred, and everything shut down, and the book tour I was originally supposed to be on got postponed. But it's nice to be here now. Unfortunately, I have to admit that it has not been easier from then till now to figure out how to give this talk. I'm here today to talk about my recently published book, Gay Faulkner, which is on the light side of 140,000 words altogether, and that's when it was edited down from much longer through the revision process. It is a project that has been with me for many years. If I wanted to say where it began, it would be possibly my very first semester at the University of Mississippi in a Faulkner seminar, but actually probably a conversation I had in an undergraduate class at the University of Tennessee at Martin. But actually the first time I read Faulkner as a senior in high school when I attempted and failed miserably to read The Sound and the Fury and understood what it was about. And I've always had an interest in something about Faulkner and trying to put my finger on what that something was. And as someone who has written this work and been so embroiled in it for so long, I guess in grad school I could do the 3-minute elevator conversation. Well, my project is about this. I've long since lost that capacity. Typically nowadays, when I try to talk about Faulkner and what my book is, it's memeable, no doubt, to try to explain to people, like I just go on and on about Faulkner, and they sort of look at me with that bless your heart look. Or, since I now live in Wisconsin, they kind of look at me with that, I've heard of a man named Faulkner look. But it is still a pleasure to be here today and try to talk about this project. But one of the reasons this project is so hard to begin talking about is not just the traditional historical silences and elisions that tend to be associated with LGBTQ plus communities and cultures and identities, but because this is a life study. It is a biographical work of William Faulkner, and so as someone speaking on this topic, it's important that I try to gauge what my audience knows about just the life of William Faulkner as a baseline. Born in 1897 in New Albany, Mississippi, spent most of his life in Oxford, but did travel to places like New Orleans and New York, and even briefly to Europe, and spent time in Hollywood, Nobel Prize-winning writer. I also spend a lot of time in the book, but will not belabor this point today, reading many of his works from the perspective of what you could call academically queer theory, though I like to think of something a little more on the ground as gay and lesbian studies, and trying to figure out where these themes show up in his work. If you ask the average Faulkner scholar to name something Faulkner wrote that's relevant to gay studies, they'll tell you his short story, Divorce in Naples. And then a long silence will ensue. And if you press somebody on it, they might mention his famous short story, A Rose for Emily, wherein Homer Baron is described as not the Marian kind, which gets any number of, especially high school students, curious about what that might have meant in context, though that's complicated. Some people will say that a novel like Absalom has fairly significant queer themes in it, but they never really bubble up to the surface. It's maybe sort of there in a novel that also is very much about race relations and very much about family ties, and it seems like it could be, but maybe isn't. Well, actually, that's one reason why in the book I don't just read one or two stories. I read broadly from Faulkner's early, very unread, kind of esoteric poetry from when he was an undergrad at the University of Mississippi, all the way through his final novels. The main novels I talk about are novels like As Are They Dying and Darrell Bundren, who is labeled queer 5 times in the novel, in which that word appears 6 times in total. Or V.K. Ratliff, who evolves over the course of Faulkner's career in so many stories and in the Snopes trilogy to end up seeming to embody representation of Cold War homosexuality that is meant to challenge expectations during the so-called Lavender Scare. Oh, but now I realize I'm no longer just talking about Faulkner's work and Faulkner's life. Now I'm talking about big moments in the history of the United States and what do people know about general American history, or about queer American history, or about queer history in Mississippi itself through the first half of the 20th century. And it becomes so difficult to figure out where to begin with a conversation about this book. And so today I thought the best place I would begin, and then just jump off from there, is with the book itself, and where I begin with my introduction, because it highlights some themes that I would like to focus on today. William Faulkner never quite fit in. Despite the odds stacked in his favor, as the oldest son of an established white family in a small southern town in the first half of the 20th century, he never could inhabit the single easy role of insider, or one of us, in the town that would so entirely define him. The dynamic of feeling different, of feeling like an outsider, and defining himself as one in opposition to the mantle of expectation readily available for him to don, most particularly defines the life, especially the young life, of this great established canonical icon of American literature. This dynamic has multiple facets. Among these facets is one that results from the coincidence of time and place. William Faulkner, American writer, came of age and entered the maturity of his artistic vision over a 60-year span of history, during which difference, or queerness, was taking on a new meaning and a subculture was forming into which he would find himself immersed, though few scholars have examined the details of his life in such a way as to reveal that beneath the mask of his multiple performances of identity, at the heart of Faulkner's sense of self, is a narrative of gay American history. From the earliest stages of his life and into his earliest efforts at self-definition, the shadow of this history cast itself onto his self-performance and greatly influenced the direction of his life and the creative impulses that generated his early prose and poetry. It remained with him even until the final novels of his prolific career, what is so remarkable is the degree to which Faulkner did not fear this shadow, he embraced it. The study that I've written is devoted to understanding what it means that Faulkner fashioned for himself a gay identity among the many other performances in which he often engaged. He knew about homosexuality, he knew homosexuals, and he could perform homosexual identity in ways far more complex and personal than his homophobic reactions and displays of psychosexual angst. In his life, he crafted what I call in my work an apocryphal gay identity, an apocryphal homosexuality, and perhaps in the Q&A I can explain the multiple meanings of what that word means, especially in reference to the archives I used to reconstruct his life. And the study I've written is an exploration of the multiple manifestations and meanings of this identity in his life and in his writing. Understanding the ways in which he apocryphized gay identity in his own performances of difference and in the fiction and poetry he produced from his observations and experiences sheds profound light on the William Faulkner we know and, as is often the case with Apocrypha, the William Faulkner we so far do not. And so, using that as a jumping off point, I wanted to start today by talking about the idea of what we know about a life and how we reconstruct it. Which is to say that the place I'll start this talk today is with an overview of an epistemology, which for those folks who are not well-versed in metaphysics and philosophy is fundamentally just questions of knowing. How do we know what we know? How do we categorize the world around us into an order that helps us understand it? And I'm going to ask that we consider an epistemological shift, a different way of knowing that is knowable because of, the second part of my talk will be an archive. Just as I'm here today speaking at the Mississippi Museums, museums are a wonderful place that archives knowledge and then uses what is archived to try to present an overview of what we understand of history. Well, archives also exist in libraries, both the books on the shelf and oftentimes in collections that the libraries keep housed in their stores so that people can come, go through those and try to understand, well, what can we deduce from the letters from this particular important, influential person, or from the ephemera from this moment in history. And if we think about how we know Faulkner and are willing to revise our sense of knowledge by using an archive, it then, of course, leads us to a revision of our understanding of his life, which then in turn can lead to a revision of how we approach his work. And as I'll say, today I'm speaking primarily of gay Faulkner as a term that would mean white male homosexuality, that in the business of queer theory we would define as cisgendered, the opposite of, say, transgendered identities. There are other ways to view Faulkner. My study doesn't delve into racial constructs, even though Faulkner talked about the black-white color line quite a bit in his fiction, and dealt with it in his life as a Mississippian in the first half of the 20th century. Because when we add race, we now have new ways to also re-envision sexuality, for the better and for the worse. Faulkner probably was, on the whole, a bit of a misogynist, and so when he depicts lesbian sexualities, he depicts them in ways that also reflect his misogyny. But when it comes to white male homosexuality, it turns out that he really was kind of surrounded by it, especially in men like Ben Wasson, a lifelong friend of his, in people like William Spratling, whom he lived with in New Orleans, in Southern writers whom he was friends with from New York to LA, forming what I'll talk about later as a Southern Protective Association. And he seemed, quite contrary to what most critics assume, fraught and overwhelmed by it. He seemed quite comfortable with it, and in fact, in his life, performed a gay identity. And I'll leave it at that, performed a gay identity. You can wonder what that means for yourself throughout his life at numerous times. So when we talk about an epistemology with gay Faulkner, again, that overly fancy term, I'm actually borrowing from a critic, though again, I mostly mean it just to nod towards the idea of what we know about Faulkner. The title of the book is Gay Faulkner, because obviously I want people to think about homosexuality in reference to the life and works of William Faulkner. But it's also important that it not be confused with the question, oh, was Faulkner gay? It's really impossible to reconstruct someone's personal life minus a profound amount of evidence that would be easy to find. Like, trust me, I've occasionally thought I might ask Roanoke up at Faulkner's house if I could take a shovel one night and see if I could dig up a box of hidden love letters. I just don't think they'll be down for that. I have spent any number of midnights at Faulkner's grave, as one does with a bottle of whiskey, wondering if he might talk to me from that cosmos all his own now, to see if he would tell me, hey, you're right. Except that that's not happened yet, despite my numerous efforts. But what I can answer is the extent to which Faulkner was constantly in his life surrounded by queer communities and comfortable in those communities. And in those communities, both within Oxford and within elsewhere, such as New Orleans and New York, seemed to understand that people viewed him as queer and didn't seem too troubled by that. So I can't answer if Faulkner was gay, but I can wonder what it means to talk about homosexuality in reference to Faulkner. And the reason I use the term epistemology is because of a famous work of queer theory. This is when I become a professor of English, right quick, called Epistemology of the Closet by a woman named Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick. This book was published back in the early 90s. It, alongside Judith Butler's book, Gender Trouble, are foundational to understanding how we talk about LGBTQ life. It is pretty heavy-hitting and theoretical, post-structuralist, you might say. But every once in a while, Sedgwick comes down from the lofty language of big, fancy, French-sounding terms and just bluntly says what she means here. And what she's constructing in this book is, as she calls it, homosexuality as we know it, which is all we can know, right? And we can't guess at things that existed so far in the past that they didn't quite have the words that we have for it. But in the 20th century, when Faulkner lived, the word homosexual had a clear, specific meaning. There were communities of people who defined themselves by this term. There was a medical establishment that used this term diagnostically, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. And Faulkner lived at a time when he had access to all of that. The other thing, however, that Sedgwick talks about in this book is that the way in which we understand homosexuality and what we know about it in the 20th century is through one primary paradigm, the closet. It is something that is hidden away, that must be exposed, that must come out. And thus the picture here of a man, I guess, peeling back a curtain, a very dapperly dressed man. That is from the cover of the original book, yes. A dapperly dressed man popping out, rearing his head, and will he come out of the closet? This becomes the kind of the bedrock on which I build the book. This idea of what can we know about the homosexuality in the world in which Faulkner lived, and what can we know about his connections to it? And Sedgwick challenges her readers by phrasing this as, has there ever been a, and she uses three primary authors for this question. Has there ever been a gay Socrates? Has there ever been a gay Shakespeare? Has there ever been a gay Proust, meaning Marcel Proust, the French writer from the early part of the 20th century? And then she pauses and says, yeah, in fact, their names were Socrates, Shakespeare, and Proust. But oftentimes in the world of academic studies of authors, when it comes to trying to discuss the degree to which an author is associated with homosexuality, the homosexual part is pushed aside as maybe not as significant to talk about in their life, as something else, as something other, as something unknowable or unprovable. Admittedly, Sedgwick doesn't ask a question about William Faulkner, though she could. She picks major white canonical authors. Herman Melville is one she writes about because of his story Billy Budd. Henry James, who actually was a homosexual man, but rarely do scholars talk about that aspect of his immensely prolific career. She interestingly chooses not to write about lesbian writers at all, or writers of color, even though at the moment when she is writing, the sort of early 20th century, there were any number of openly gay writers writing very openly gay stories. She's interested in canonical writers whose identities might or might not have been closeted. And so when she asks, has there ever been a gay, Faulkner, as she doesn't ask, but she could have, again, she boils us down to, yes, and what if his name was something to the effect of Faulkner, but then she pauses. So I'm going to go through a little bit of a reading from Sedgwick because she ends up explaining this idea really well and the way in which the closet works to hide identities for important authors. Has there ever been a gay Socrates? Has there ever been a gay Shakespeare? Has there ever been a gay Proust? Does the Pope wear a dress? If these questions startle, it is not the least as tautologies. A short answer, though a very incomplete one, might be that not only have there been a gay Socrates, a gay Shakespeare, and Proust, but that their names are Socrates, Shakespeare, and Proust. And beyond that legion, dozens or hundreds of the most centrally canonic figures and what people typically consider our culture and our literature who could be aligned with this same stream of thought. However, what's now in place in contrast in most scholarship and most curricula is an even briefer response to questions like, is there a gay Faulkner or gay Proust or gay Shakespeare? Don't ask. Or sometimes less laconically, you shouldn't know. The vast preponderance of scholarship and teaching accordingly, even among liberal academics, does simply neither ask nor know. At this point, then, Sedgwick goes through what is effectively a prose poem of all the ways in which homosexuality and homosexual themes in works are dismissed. And I'm going to read this, even though it's a long quote, because it is, again, central to understanding the questions I'm exploring in my book and the way in which I will use the archive to try to reconstruct Faulkner's life. 1. Passionate language of same-sex attraction was extremely common during whatever period is under discussion, and therefore must have been completely meaningless. Or 2. Same-sex genital relations may have been perfectly common during the period under discussion, but since there was no language about them, they must have been completely meaningless. Or 3. Attitudes about homosexuality were intolerant back then, unlike now, so people probably didn't do anything. Or 4. Prohibitions against homosexuality didn't exist back then, unlike now, so if people did anything, it was completely meaningless. Or 5. The word homosexuality wasn't coined until the year 1869, so everyone before then must have obviously been heterosexual, and of course, heterosexuality has always existed. Or 6. The author under discussion is certified or rumored to have had an attachment to someone of the other sex, so their feelings about people of their own sex must have been completely meaningless. Or 7. There is no actual proof of homosexuality, such as semen taken from the body of another man or a nude photograph with another woman, so the author must be assumed to have been ardently and exclusively heterosexual. Or, as a last resort, number 8, the author or the author's important attachments may very well have been homosexual, but it would be provincial to let so insignificant a fact make any difference at all to our understanding of any serious project of life, writing, or thought. These responses, as we have seen, are some real questions of sexual difference and historicity, but they only reflect them, and they do not reflect on them. The family resemblance among this group of extremely common responses comes from their closeness to the core grammar of don't ask, you shouldn't know. It didn't happen, it doesn't make any difference, it didn't mean anything, it doesn't have interpretive consequences. Stop asking just now. Stop asking just here. We know in advance the kind of difference that could be made by the invocation of this difference, so it makes no difference. We will refuse to believe that it can possibly mean. And if that seems extreme, I would say from my experiences in the academy that especially with LGBTQ questions about major canonical writers, we tend to fall into some of the same paradigms of no, it doesn't mean anything, or if it does, there's only one story, or if Faulkner knew one gay man, he did still marry that woman, at least for half of his life, and obviously must have wanted to marry her from much earlier in it. I'm not here to question anything about the nature of Faulkner's relationship with his wife, Estelle. There is a long-standing idea that Faulkner was in love with Estelle from the time they were roughly 6 to 8 years old. That might be a reconstruction of their love life from after Faulkner's death due to some interviews Estelle gave in the wake of his funeral that may not reflect the reality that Estelle actually married another man and had 2 children by him and was gone from Oxford, Mississippi for an 11-year period in the 1920s when Faulkner most ardently seemed to explore queer lifestyles with men like Ben Wasson in Oxford, Mississippi, and with people like William Spratling and a whole slew of other figures in New Orleans and even in Europe, where he and Spratling would go together in the 1920s. So in order to try to reconstruct some of this, I rely on an archive, but not just any archive. An archive in this sense is simply that collection of materials that one can use. There are materials that are alluded to in the archive that I chose to do my studies in, that, again, the compilers of the archives, the people who are creating them, allude to materials that were purely oral traditions, things they were told that are not recorded in, say, letters, in their correspondences, or recorded in typed interview notes, but seem to have happened at some point in the interview process. I'll get to an example of that in a bit. But in this case, the archive that I use is the most important Faulkner archive of all. William Faulkner died in 1962. Shortly before his death, actually in about the 5 or so years before his death, his daughter Jill was a student at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia. Faulkner thus spent quite a bit of time in the latter years of his life in Charlottesville, and towards his death, he and Estelle seemed to be planning to sell Roanoke in Oxford and move to Charlottesville, though that would not occur because of Faulkner's untimely death by heart attack in July 6th, I think, of 1962, so not too far off from an anniversary today. At the University of Virginia, Faulkner met a young professor named Joseph Blotner. Blotner and Faulkner became very good friends, and at some point, Faulkner suggested to Blotner that it would be okay for him to be a biographer. After Faulkner's death, Blotner approached Estelle, Faulkner's widow, and was named by Estelle as Faulkner's official biographer. And thus, in the mid-1960s, began an enormous and really brilliant task of trying to pull together as much information on Faulkner's life as he possibly could. He spent over 10 years on this project, and the notes that he compiled from this occupy like 70 some odd boxes in a university somewhere. They include absolutely everything that he could get his hands on relevant to Faulkner, including numerous firsthand interviews, ephemera, photocopies of newspaper articles, and all this. Sometimes it really blows my mind. In a time before the internet, I take for granted how easy it is when I want to look up something. I just Google it. I've not had to write a whole lot of letters to like the army to ask for someone's like records or something like that, especially as Blotner would find out in trying to find William Faulkner's army records. They don't exist because he didn't actually serve in the U.S. Army, even though he would sometimes kind of hint that maybe he did. But Blotner began the process of working on this immense biography. And when it came time to write this biography, he ended up writing this massive 2-volume, multi-thousand-page tome that, frankly, if I had to really condense it to anything, is almost like the encyclopedia of William Faulkner. It has so much extraneous detail, receipts from like dinners at certain restaurants in New York, and just enormous amount of detail, effectively in chronological order. And while it is a brilliant masterpiece of biographical detection work, it is nonetheless it lacks a bit of narrative. So when he published this first volume in 1974, Joseph Blotner began almost immediately having people kind of come out of the woodwork and point out many errors, especially in the 1974 edition. Despite all of his hard work, he struggled to get clear answers from Faulkner's family about Faulkner's pretty significant alcoholism and how that hurt his life. It actually took Blotner a long time to get it confirmed that Faulkner didn't die at home, that he actually died in Byhalia, Mississippi, where he had gone for some treatment because he was concerned that he was going on another bender. And another piece of information that Blotner struggled a lot to find out about were Faulkner's affairs, in this case with other women, people like Joan Williams, Meta Carpenter, and others, with whom Faulkner seems to have had romantic relationships. Many of these women did not want to come forward for the 1974 volume because Estelle was still alive. Estelle would die in 1972. This edition would come out in 1974, and over the next 10 years, Blotner received an enormous amount of additional information, trying to correct some of the record. But not all of the information he got is relevant simply to affairs with other women, nor is it only a matter of finding out that, yes, Faulkner, it turns out, really was a fairly hardcore alcoholic, and that was a major part of the last few years of his life. But even in all of this, and at one point I was talking to a member of my dissertation committee many years ago, and this was still an early stage project, and I was saying, I'm going to go and look at the archives on which all this is based. And that man, who was an excellent Faulkner scholar, don't get me wrong, thought about the 2,000-page some odd massive tome, and then the revised edition that came out in 1984, which is much shorter, at only 600 pages or so, and manages to craft much more of a coherent narrative of Faulkner's life. He's like, what more could you find there? If it's not already in print, surely there's nothing in those archives that hasn't been picked clean by scholars at this point. But what I ended up doing was I went to Southeast Missouri State University, where they have an archive of Joseph Blotner's original notes. This archive was established with the help of two men. A man named L.D. Brodsky, who is a poet from the St. Louis area, who had connections to Southeast Missouri State University in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and another man named Robert Hamlin, Bob Hamlin. Sorry, I just like Bob. It's a more fun name. Bob Hamlin was a graduate student at the University of Mississippi in 1962. He also, by the way, served in the National Guard in 1962 as a graduate student at Ole Miss. People who know some Mississippi history can imagine what his first few weeks of campus life were like, with Meredith's arrival on campus. Bob Hamlin and his wife Kay were from Boonville, Mississippi. He recently corrected me when I once said in a post online that he was from Corinth. He's like, nope, Boonville. I apologize, Bob. He's originally from Boonville, Mississippi, got his doctorate at the University of Mississippi, went up to Cape Girardeau, and then began working with L.D. Brodsky to collect what they have there as this marvelous archive of Faulkner's works called the Brodsky Collection. With the Brodsky Collection, one thing he and L.D. did was drive up to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where Joseph Blotner was working at the time, and with a rather significant cash payment, were able to get a hold of the Blotner papers, which were stored on an enormous number of egg crates that they loaded up into the back of the car and drove down to SEMO, where now you can peruse it for yourself. What I have here in terms of images is one of Bob's most recent books that he's used the archive for on William Faulkner, also published by the University Press of Mississippi. Just a photograph I took on I-55 driving south of the exit for Cape Girardeau, so, in case you didn't know where. And actually, in terms of what some of these notes look like, this is from the interview with William Spratling that I'll be talking about in just a minute. The handwriting on that would be handwritten notes that Blotner added to it, and his interview process I'll get to in just a minute. But this is a massive archive, and it's not just that there's materials there that have not yet been mined for meaning. It also has to do with the way in which one approaches that material. That material includes interview notes. For the interview notes, the way that Blotner would do his interviews, at least from what I can deduce from going through these notes, is he would go and sit down with people who knew Faulkner one-on-one, sometimes for over the course of multiple days. I believe that for the most part, he wrote down his notes in shorthand on little steno pads, like you would see a reporter use in like the 1950s or something like that. Blotner had pretty rough handwriting, and it's in shorthand, fairly indecipherable. So I've seen these. I tried to read them, and I couldn't make heads or tails of them. Then he would take these shorthand notes, and he would type them into long-form interviews, including with his quotes, and not grammatically correct or anything, sort of sometimes wandering, but at least get him into some kind of concrete sense right after the interview of what was said, with recording the date, whom he interviewed, where the interview occurred. And then that would, of course, eventually become what he mines for his own writing with the 1-volume and 2-volume editions. There's also, boxes upon boxes of letters and correspondences. There's an entire box basically dedicated to Blotner trying to get information from the United States military about Faulkner's military service, because at that point, early in the years after Faulkner's death, it was unclear that Faulkner hadn't really served in the military very much. And then there's just an enormous amount of ephemera, just newspaper clippings, originals of editorials that Faulkner wrote for some minor newspaper over here, or something that someone wrote about Faulkner over here, or interview materials when he would hear about somebody having written something somewhere else. He would get a copy of it and throw it in there just in case it would ever come in handy. List upon list of books that Faulkner may have owned or read. Just all sorts of material to go through. And a lot of it does feel like it couldn't necessarily be necessary for creating one life story. But then, of course, you have to choose what does go into a life story and how you want to tell that story. So if that's the archive that I relied most heavily on, I use that archive to think about what information is there and think about whether or not the way in which it's been understood and interpreted is all. If there's not another way to continue revising our understanding of Faulkner based on where we are in our time now and our ability to maybe be more open about things that in the past have been more closeted. So in order to kind of not wrap up immediately, but wrap up in this talk over the next, say, 15 minutes or so, I want to talk about 4 specific pieces of evidence that I was able to nibble away at and find some stories that start to reveal a little bit about the ways in which the archive can help us revise what we know about William Faulkner. I cannot emphasize enough that this is not even remotely the whole book, a whole chapter. These are just small threads that when you start to peel away at them, the whole sweater unravels into yarn on the floor, and suddenly you realize that underneath it was a whole different set of clothes hung on that same hanger. in the closet. I'm sorry, that metaphor just sort of had to happen right there. And so I want to go through a few of these very quickly, and I keep alluding to William Spratling, who was, by the way, Faulkner's roommate in New Orleans. Spratling was an artist, visual artist, did sketches, architecture. He was living in New Orleans. I actually don't entirely know how William Faulkner met William Spratling, but throughout Faulkner's time in New Orleans, beginning in 1925 through around 1928, his consistent roommate was William Spratling, who was an openly gay man. He would end up in Mexico in the 1960s, where Joseph Blotner would go to interview him. And he died in a car accident just a few years after Faulkner's death. When Faulkner went to New Orleans in 1925, he was there to meet Sherwood Anderson. He was there to kind of work on a novel, but he was mostly there to take a trip to Europe. And he ended up making that trip to Europe in the latter part of 1925, the second half of the year, with Spratling. And the story I want to tell about this is about their arrival in Europe, their first night in Europe in early August of 1925, when they pulled into port in Genoa, Italy. Generally speaking, this incident is considered probably the inspiration for that story, Divorce in Naples, with a lot of revisions and using different pieces to get there. But in terms of this story, it's actually kind of more interesting, not just to tell the story, but the story of how the story is created. So William Spratling was interviewed by Joseph Blotner. It's a long interview. I think it's either 6 to 9 pages of typed notes plus shorthand that I can't decipher. It is also, Spratling's interest in the biography is based on 2 versions of his published memoir. Shortly after Faulkner's death, he published a short essay-length version of their time together in New Orleans and Europe. And then he took that material and altered it just a little bit, not terribly significantly, for his own book-length memoir that was published just before his death. So we have an interview and notes from that interview that exist in typed form. We have 2 versions of a memoir, but actually the story also relies on an interview with Ben Wasson, another one of Faulkner's friends, who verified some of the information about this story. So they arrive in Genoa, Italy. They've been in a boat. They want to have some fun. They go to a local establishment, and they begin to get riotously drunk. Spratling and Faulkner, the 2 Williams, are getting very drunk together. Spratling starts to go a little wild and crazy. He notices that across the bar there is a man and a woman, and he convinces himself that the woman is a prostitute and the man is her pimp. He then proceeds to take coins out of his pocket and throw them on the ground in front of them, making all sorts of lewd and suggestive statements, and then dances around on top of those coins, which leads to the owner of the establishment calling the police, who supposedly arrest William Spratling for the night because he was defacing the image of the king on the coins. I suspect that he was simply thrown in the drunk tank because he was a little bit too out of control and an American tourist in Genoa, Italy. The next morning, when William Faulkner goes to pick up Spratling, Spratling would report that Faulkner was very glum and very down. And when Spratling challenged Faulkner, "Why are you acting this way?" Faulkner's response was, "Well, of course I'm in a bad mood, since I missed all the fun myself." But the interesting question is, what fun did he miss? A drunken night in a hotel? In the original 2-volume biography, Blotner tells the story of Spratling getting drunk, of Spratling going to jail, and of Spratling being retrieved by Faulkner in the morning, and Faulkner relating that he was just so glum that he didn't get to enjoy that experience himself. Blotner also relates that Faulkner wrote his gay friend in Mississippi, Ben Wasson, a letter. And in that letter, William Faulkner told Ben that he, not Spratling, had been the one arrested and in jail that night. So he can brag about a story that wasn't his own, which is basically what we call fiction writing. So Ben Wasson told Blotner about that letter in his own interview. But that letter does not exist in any archive or any published version of Faulkner's letters. So we just have to rely on what Ben Wasson told Blotner about it, which also gets us to the other interesting part. In the 1984 revision of the biography, Joseph Blotner just throws in passing that, by the way, Spratling confided to Blotner during their interview that while he was in jail that night in Genoa, Italy, he performed sexual favors on another male prisoner. Now here's the other fun part of it. I dug through those Blotner papers to find that one line. I dug and dug and dug. That would obviously be the type of smoking gun kind of, wow, what did Faulkner know? And is that the story Faulkner appropriated? Because we don't have Ben Wasson's letter to know what exactly Faulkner confessed to when he wrote home to his friend. Unfortunately, that one line does not exist in the typed notes. It is something that is purely something that Spratling told Blotner, and that Blotner later reported. Only when Blotner later reported it, it then ends up in Joel Williamson's also magisterial biography of Faulkner, William Faulkner in Southern History. Gary Richards, in one of his essays about William Faulkner in the French Quarter, uses this information, this incredibly important information, but it's all based on something that was just told to Blotner and doesn't exist in the notes, but Blotner verifies it by writing it, and now we have multiple pieces of data, multiple pieces of information from an archive that are coming together to make a story that's not fully told in the original version, that's not fully cited in the next version, but now does exist in print form, and says an awful lot about what's maybe really going on in Faulkner's life and his comfort levels with or understandings of homosexuality. And I put it out in this way here, not mention any notes, but then not included in one volume biography, then included in a 2-volume biography, and later retold. This is actually the traditional way in which the closet works. A piece of information is relayed as just like spoken oral history. It can be ignored or denied or set aside, but over time it comes out, it leaks. But that's not actually always what happened with Blotner's version of the biography. Tennessee Williams, another Mississippi writer. Faulkner had some interactions with Williams. They seem to have a bit of a fraught relationship that I have spent a long time trying to figure out what I think about it and unpack it. When Blotner was interviewing people about Tennessee Williams, he interviewed a woman named Monique Lang, who related to Blotner. And then Blotner recorded in his typed notes a story about a party that William Faulkner went to with Monique Lang and Tennessee Williams. This is a copy of those typed notes. And it bears reading this out because this is the original version of the story that Blotner was told and typed and exists in an archive. Jean Stein looked like a millionaireess, rich and rigid. She had some doubt if they went to bed. Jean set up a big dinner at one of the best Paris restaurants. Tennessee Williams and his Italian boyfriend were there. Williams was worshipful. He asked a question about Negroes, word from the time, in the South, and William Faulkner clammed up for 2 hours. Monique said it was hell. Later in the evening, when she asked William Faulkner if he minded if she went on with them to another party, certainly elsewhere, he laughed and said, "Go with your queers." That line, "go with your queers," is one of those lines you can cite. When Faulkner says it, there's no doubt in anyone's mind, shouldn't be, that he means something pejorative. He means those people like that. This is the version of the story that Blotner hears. When he writes it in the 1-volume edition of the biography, notice what's happened to Tennessee Williams' boyfriend. Highlighted there, the other guests included Tennessee Williams and a young friend of his from Italy. So a piece of information in the interview notes that it's not just a friend from Italy, it's a boyfriend from Italy, disappears, but a piece of information does remain. "Go with your queers" remains. So we still get the full impact of Faulkner's possible homophobia, but we don't actually get anything more than maybe Tennessee Williams was a closeted gay man and Faulkner might have inferred that. So what exactly is going on here? In 1984, in the 2-volume version, everything about this other person in the party disappears entirely. Tennessee Williams is still at the party. Jean Stein is still there. Here we have a story with Hemingway involved. We still have the African Americans in the South language. But all that remains is "go with your queers" to Monique Lang when William Faulkner and her are speaking at the end of the party. This is such an odd thing to see in a biography because usually over time we think of the world progressing towards a more open understanding of who an author is. Okay, so there was a boyfriend at the party. What does that mean? It means that Joseph Blotner was aware that William Faulkner was interacting with gay communities that weren't just individual men who were rumored to be gay. We're talking about men who were in homosexual relationships with their significant others at parties where Faulkner was. And in this case, something occurred where Faulkner did say something about those queer individuals that comes across a bit rough. But all we're left with from the biographical record over time is the erasure of the gay men at the party to just the example of homophobia. But then what did Blotner really know about all this? What did Blotner know about all of this when he was writing the biography? Why did he make decisions to suppress or later include other information? And how can we assess that? Because I'm actually interested in assessing the life of William Faulkner. I'm not actually interested in assessing Joseph Blotner's personal understanding of homosexuality or his own hang-ups or open-mindedness, except to the extent that it helps us reevaluate our relationship with the records that we claim matter, the published information on Faulkner, versus what's really there and how else we can interpret it. So again, as I was saying earlier, the 74 edition is a bit of an encyclopedia. The 84 edition is certainly a narrative and a much easier read, and you get a sense of Faulkner's life and how his life was influencing his writing. That's a nice thing. The other thing that's occurring in this revision is that Blotner is gaining more and more information, and he's gaining it from some key sources. Among those sources is, interestingly, a letter from a man named Paul Rogers. Paul Rogers claimed to be a classmate of William Faulkner and Ben Wasson in the early 1919 and 1920 at the University of Mississippi. Without really any impetus for this at all, Paul Rogers, in April of 1980, now a much older man, wrote to Joseph Blotner a long letter about what he thought Blotner had gotten right and wrong in his first version of the biography. And one of the things that Paul Rogers ends up harping on throughout this letter is just how much Blotner seems to imply, even in that 74 version, that there might have been some queer goings-on in Oxford, Mississippi, and in Faulkner's life. For the record, there's not all that much in the 1974 biography to justify that. But Rogers can't help himself in focusing on the homosexuality on campus in order to deny that it was there. Again, he wasn't asked a question by Blotner. He offered this on his own. The University of Mississippi is the one place where I have lived as an adult that homosexuality was a theme of no interest to the students. To his credit, when Blotner was able to respond a little over a month later in May of 1980, Blotner immediately points out at the start of his letter, Faulkner did write lesbian-themed poetry in the Mississippian, now the Daily Mississippian, the campus newspaper, based on Mallarmé's La Présmédée d'un Faun or Sapphics by Swinburne. Faulkner played with the tropes from those and wrote lesbian-themed writing. Are you sure that people on campus were totally ignorant? And then Joseph Blotner drops this interesting little line, his own acknowledgement of the people in Faulkner's circle and what he understood about them. I don't know if you knew Ben Wasson, but it has been suggested to me that Ben was a homosexual. William Faulkner met Ben Wasson before World War I, when he would leave, try to fight in Canada, ended up being quarantined through the great influenza pandemic of 1918, never see a day in uniform, possibly never even fly a plane in training, come back and claim that he had been behind the enemy lines, had a metal plate in his head, and a limp from an injury. But he met Ben Wasson, and then when he came back to Oxford, he became very, very intimate friends with Ben Wasson. Towards the end of his own life, in the early 1980s, Ben Wasson was trying to write a memoir that I think is most properly read as his response to Blotner's biography. And it's not that Wasson says anything against Blotner. It's that Blotner publishes the 1974 two-volume biography, and Wasson then begins to write a memoir that he does not complete before his own death in the early 1980s. The manuscript falls to his sister, who delivers it to the University Press of Mississippi. I had the pleasure of being in touch with a few folks from the press at that time who talked about the editorial process wherein they took what was sort of long passages and tried to arrange them into a narrative so that they would, meet the approval of the family and would also tell a story. That is still a book that's available, and it's just your typical memoir of somebody who knew somebody famous. Wasson was one of Faulkner's early editors and helped Faulkner enter New York City and meet the right people who had helped get his career launched in late 1920s and early 1930s. When Ben Wasson tried to edit The Sound and the Fury, Faulkner snapped at him and said, basically, don't. I know you mean well, bud, but so do I. But Ben Wasson was writing this memoir, and Joseph Blotner was so interested in knowing about what Wasson had to say that he wrote to the University Press of Mississippi to ask to see those notes before they were published. And when you start going through the works cited and the endnotes of Blotner's revised biography, that particular memoir shows up an inordinately large number of times for so short and slim a volume. I argue in the book that this memoir actually fits into the paradigm of gay-themed memoirs throughout the 20th century, where there is a coded form of chivalry that people don't want to say too much, but do want to imply a little bit. It's from this memoir that we hear Ben Wasson tell stories about Faulkner coming to his dorm room, asking Ben to join him in the Grove, where Faulkner would sit there and open up a book of Conrad Aiken poetry and read it aloud to Ben Wasson. The volume in question, Turns and Moods, I believe is the volume, is queer-themed poetry that includes explicit reference to homosexuality. Wasson doesn't mention that part, but he does mention undergrads at the university walking by, seeing Faulkner and Ben, and giving them queer looks. He also talks about going north of campus to the home of Phil Stone, another family friend who sometimes is aligned with homosexuality. I contend that's not the best and most productive line of thought to understand gay Faulkner. But they would go there together when the Stone family was away, and they would sit and listen to music together in the front parlor late into the evening, listening, as Ben Wasson explains, to the music swell up and have together this immense emotional experience, alone, sequestered, off campus, at which point they would walk back in the dark woods to their dorms or homes across town. And I actually think that some of the imagery of that shows up in many of Faulkner's works. Ben Wasson is an openly gay man, as openly as one can be at that time period, and was one of the few people in Faulkner's life who remained with him throughout his life as a close supporter and close friend. And when he wrote that memoir, it becomes central to what Blotner wants to say to Paul Rogers. Blotner follows up with Rogers. A couple of recent books have tried to assess William Faulkner's sexuality along predictable and I think somewhat unlikely lines. I do remember, though, a Charlottesville doctor, a member of the Farmington Hunt, asked me about it obliquely because of his own orientation, I think. And then we actually had the quote, I don't know if you knew Ben Wasson. In his letters, Blotner, is willing to admit what he knows about folks, but also notice the telling references in this letter. Maybe a gay man would be interested in wondering if Faulkner was himself queer. But really, that's not what Blotner thinks is likely. And so wouldn't you know it, some of this information just doesn't make it in to printed form. Meanwhile, Paul Rogers responds, but one thing is certain, that the subject of homosexuality was not at that time on campus of much concern as it is now and has been for the last 50 years. In fact, at the university, there was only one word for it, indicated by the letters C and S, and since this is a public forum, I'm not going to explain what that means, but I'm going to let you infer. And the male student's pun donor, or point of honor, was phrased as follows: if one ever approaches you, sock 'em. Early 1920s, late 19-teens, here is an undergraduate at the University of Mississippi admitting that there were no homosexuals on campus. How do I know that? Well, because we talked about it all the time and even had a code for what we would do if one approached you, which implies that maybe there are people who are gay there, and people know this and talk about it, but in those hush-hush tones of the closet, which then ends up influencing so much about how people are responding to what we understand of this man we call William Faulkner. But if we start thinking differently about what we know as basic truths of William Faulkner, a lot more emerges that is productive, that is generative, that shows us how brilliant and wonderful he was at playing with signs and images and ideas. I'm running very short on time, and I want to have some time for some questions here today. I can talk a little bit about this man, another gay writer from Mississippi, from Water Valley in particular, who was very influential to William Faulkner, but I do want to have some time for questions before running out of time. So, I see I should have given you more warning on that one, Chris, my bad.
No,
do we have any questions or anything that I could try to answer in what time we have left?
We do. We have this from the live stream, a question about how much, if any, of Blotner's Southeast Missouri archive is digitized and accessible.
That I would not know. I do know that the Southeast Missouri has the Center for Faulkner Studies there. It's now run by a man named Chris Rieger, who was, for a Star Trek reference, Bob Hamlin's number one. The next generation, for anybody out there. I started with the meme. I got to stay pop culture. And he runs that archive now. I call them the keepers of the Blotner papers. I feel very confident if one reached out to the center, they would be able to answer that question. I know they've been working in recent years on a clearer kind of catalog of what's there and arranging it. And there's more than just the Blotner papers. They also have quite a bit of actual like first-hand materials from Faulkner and other things that Brodsky purchased over the years. I don't know how much of it's digitized at this point.
We have about 3 minutes left, but it's hard for me to pass up. I mean, Creekmore is such a great bridge to next week's program with Eudora Welty. Could you maybe for the next few minutes talk about Creekmore?
Hubert Creekmore was a little bit younger than William Faulkner by about 10 years, but his older brothers were Faulkner's age and in Faulkner's class. They rushed to fraternity at the University of Mississippi with Faulkner. They ended up becoming very good friends because at the time, the governor, Lee Russell, had forbidden so-called secret societies on campus for a long, complicated reason. And as they rushed to fraternity together, this is actually what precipitated Faulkner's leaving the university. Many students left the university, withdrew rather than be expelled for being members of SAE fraternity at the time. Faulkner would write about seeing the Creekmores in New Haven, Connecticut, where one had transferred afterwards, and seemed to keep some connection to them, so that when their younger brother, the youngest of 4 children, started at the University of Mississippi, Creekmore became in many ways like the next Faulkner. Faulkner fashioned for himself this sense on campus of a literary vagabond. Hubert Creekmore was actually named, like some people are most likely to succeed. He was named literary vagabond in the Ole Miss, the university the university yearbook. He joined the Scribblers, a literary organization Faulkner never joined, but he also joined the Marionettes, the theater company that Faulkner and Ben Wasson and one of the Somervilles had founded on campus. And he just had a bit of a reputation as a literary figure. He then became friends with other SAEs like Phil Stone and Ben Wasson, and thus in around 1930, when he got ready to move to New York City, and this was collected in the Harry Ransom Center, a different archive down in Austin, Texas, he wrote to Phil Stone a letter in which it's hard to read, but which he says, "Hey, Phil, can you remind Bill to send me that letter of introduction to Hal Smith, who was William Faulkner's editor at the time?" I would contend that if they knew each other in this way at the time, then it's not hard to imagine that later in his life, especially in the 40s, when Creekmore finally did start publishing novels, including a novel titled The Welcome, an LGBTQ-themed novel set in a town modeled after Water Valley, just south of Oxford, with Ole Miss co-eds who have now graduated and are in an interesting situation. It's a bit of a tragic novel. That Welcome was reviewed by the New York Times Review of Books in the exact same review that William Faulkner's Requiem for Intruder in the Dust was reviewed in. It's impossible to imagine that Faulkner was unaware of the career of Hubert Creekmore. And if he was aware of this person whom he knew personally in their career, would he have read a gay-themed novel set in the South? And so some of those are the interesting things about Creekmore that I would trope on if we had more time. So, yeah.
Well, and for folks who are interested, I bet there will be a few words said about him during next week's program, too. This has been great. It's been fascinating. I wish we had more time, but thank you all for watching. Pip, thank you so much for this. We'll look forward to more in the future, and I hope that we see you all next week. Thank you again.
Thank you.